Hello. So today I'm talking about artifacts and social dependence. So I have a handout and I'll just share my screen with you. The handout's also uploaded to the conference website. So a very broadly accepted condition on artifacts is that they depend on the singular intentions of their makers. So a carpenter, for example, makes a chair out of wood and other material. So we want to say that that chair is mind dependent insofar as it depends on the intention of its maker to make it, not just it, but specifically a chair. So this appears in a variety of different accounts of artifacts. So Risto Hilpinen, Paul Bloom, Amy Thomasson, Simon Evnine, myself, among others. And so we could kind of formulate this as a general condition on being an artifact. So we could say that X is an artifact of kind K, where K is any artifact kind, only if X is the successful product of an intention to make an artifact of kind K. And so this applies to, chairs, cell phones, pinball machines, gas lamps, whatever artifact kind we're talking about. So is this, however, a complete picture of the mind dependence of artifacts? Well, a number of authors have suggested recently that actually artifacts have an important social dimension. So I've kind of broken these down into the three main components of how this social dimension might manifest itself. So first, we had, back in the early 90s, Randall Dipert suggest that artifact makers, artifact that they make, be recognized by others as being an artifact of the kind they're trying to make, or as having the function associated with that kind of thing. So he assumes that all artifacts have functions. And so the idea is that, like, if you modify something to make, I don't know, a chair, then part of the content of your intention is that others recognize that the thing you made is a chair and thus is intended to kind of like serve a particular function. So he writes, artifacts require us as agents to think of other cognitive and acting agents, their attitudes and thought and emotional mechanisms, and the contents of their thoughts and attitudes. Okay, so as a general condition on artifacts, I don't think that's quite right. I think it's possible to make a chair without intending that it be recognized as a chair by anybody. Nonetheless, there is something important in what Dipert is pointing to. So the second kind of social dimension is brought out by Amy Thomasson. And on her account, she says that makers' creations, the things that they make, are subject to public norms of creation, use, regard, and treatment. And so why is this a social dimension to artifacts? Well, it's because these norms are sustained by social groups. They're public. So she says, to intend to make a work of art, a cathedral, a cheese sauce, or a top hat is, inter alia, to intend to make something that is to be recognized as subject to certain norms of use, treatment, regard, etc., by an appropriate intended audience. Okay, so she gives the example of a salad fork and writes, what it is to be a salad fork is, in part, to be intended to be recognizable as subject to certain norms of use, that is, to be used for a certain purpose, namely eating salad, in a certain context where there's full dinner service, including larger forks, in a certain way. So you're supposed to hold it by the handle in one hand, and then you stab rather than shovel the food, and by certain individuals. So grown people, the size here not being indicative that it's for children. So the idea is that, well, there's these different norms that arise that govern what features different artifact kinds have, what, how those artifacts are supposed to be, of a given kind are supposed to be used, how they're supposed to be treated, regarded, even recycled. And so in this way, any maker's creation is not just dependent on their own intention, but it's also dependent on the kind of fit or satisfaction with the public norm. Okay, third, we have this insight from Marcel Scheele or Scheele. I'm not sure which, my Dutch is non-existent. So on his account, he points out that makers, their creations and the functions they ascribe to the things they make are determined by, or at least partly dependent upon, the collective acceptance of the maker's attempt as successful by a particular audience or community or social group. So Scheele gives two important examples. One is this church in the Netherlands. This is something that church for a long time, as church attendance dropped, it became disused. And then through a transfer of ownership, it became an event hall for semi-public gatherings, dinner parties, concerts, whatever. And the point is just that the church wasn't modified. It's not like turning one thing into another. It's rather just that the relevant group accepted that this building was no longer a church and it was now an event hall. So the relevant group might include municipal officials, it could include owners, it could include realtors, who through this collective acceptance as here's this artifact, it ceased to be one thing and is now becoming another thing, all through them accepting it as such. The second example he gives is this figure 8 device that's used in the climbing community as an abseiling device. And then it was intended to just be an abseiling device, but slowly the climbing community also used it as a belaying device. And eventually it was marketed in that way. And so the thought is that, well, it has this new, it acquires this new function as a belaying device merely through the acceptance of such by the relevant community, in this case, the climbing community, to the point that even the manufacturers start marketing it as at least partly different kind of thing. So I think all three of these different kinds of social dependence of artifacts are correct to an extent. But I think the order, at least as I presented them, is in reverse, like in terms of priority. So first, what we have is this collective acceptance of a particular group that some attempt by a maker was successful in making a K. Where K could be a prototype artifact or it could be an extant artifact. Either way, there is an acceptance of the maker's attempt as successful. And then if it's a prototype artifact, this will give rise to certain public norms governing how it's to be used, what features are kind of, constitutive of that kind of thing, and so on, as well as like how it's to be treated and regarded. So the acceptance of success by a particular group gives rise to these norms, and these norms governing the artifact kind are kind of established and transmitted by a particular audience, what I'm going to call the K audience. So you have the artifact kind K, it's accepted by a particular audience, the K audience, and this gives rise to the norms governing that kind of artifact, what I'm calling the K norm. So in turn, once you have this norm established and the production of Ks, whatever they are, chairs, handguns, cell phones, whatever, becomes widespread, then you get to Dipert's insight, which is that all of a sudden makers are making stuff, making a particular kind of thing with the intention that it satisfy or meet this norm, such that the relevant audience is recognizing their attempt as making something of that particular kind, where something of that particular kind has a certain use, has certain features, is to be treated in a certain way, and so on. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, I said at the beginning we have this general condition on artifacts where X is an artifact of kind K only if X is the successful product of an intention to make an artifact of kind K. Given the insights from Dipert, Thomasson, and Scheele, it looks like, well, there is this important social dimension to being an artifact, at least often. So what I think this suggests is that actually we need to alter that general condition on artifacts to be disjunctive. So this disjunctive account is going to say that for all x and all artifact kinds k, if x is an artifact of kind k, then there's some agent s, the maker, and x either depends on s's intention to make a k, first disjunct, or x also depends on s's intention to make a k as being accepted as having satisfied the k norm by the relevant k audience. Okay. So importantly, I think this is just kind of like a rough formulation of this account. What I want to say basically is that artifacts can either just depend on the singular intentions of their makers, or they can also depend on some social group as having accepted the maker's intention as successful. Now, importantly, this disjunctive account is inclusive insofar as you can have both disjuncts holding, but importantly, I don't think you can have the second disjunct hold, but not the first. That is, collective acceptance of the maker as being successful, I don't think is sufficient to make an artifact. The maker also actually, in fact, has to have the relevant intention and attempt to make something of a particular kind and so on. And then you have the relevant audience accept that attempt as successful. Okay. So something kind of like similar is happening in Thomasson's more recent work on artifacts, where she recognizes this social dimension. And she distinguishes, or she at least calls artifacts that are subject to these norms public artifacts. She doesn't use the term private artifact, but I'm assuming that the distinction here is supposed to be between public and private artifacts. And I take these, at least the way she uses public artifact, to correspond to each disjunct in the account that I just formulated. Importantly, though, Thomasson seems to think that this public-private distinction applies to artifact kinds rather than individual artifacts. And this is where we importantly diverge. So it's not that specific kinds of things like salad forks or chairs or whatever, that the whole kind is a public artifact and then the whole other kind is like a private artifact. Rather, I think whether something is a public or private artifact just depends on the context of its creation rather than the kind of thing that it is. So there is this often discussed example involving Robinson Crusoe. I think Rebecca Mason gave it the moniker, the Robinson Crusoe test, and the idea was supposed to be that like it's a way of distinguishing between artifact kinds and institutional kinds. So the idea is that, okay, you have Robinson Crusoe on his island. Can Crusoe make something of kind K? If yes, then K is an artifact kind. If no, then K is an institutional kind. So the idea was, artifacts satisfy that general mind dependence constraint I gave at the beginning, whereas institutional kinds necessarily require this collective mind dependence or collective intentionality. And so, Robinson Crusoe can make a chair, but he can't make money or the Supreme Court or whatever. Okay, so applying the Robinson Crusoe test to artifacts, though, it seems, at least to me, the intuition I have is that Crusoe can make an artifact of any given kind. He can make a cathedral, well, bracket that, I'll come back to it in a sec. He can make a top hat or a cheese sauce or a salad fork or a figure-8 climbing device or whatever the case may be, or a chair. And thus, any of those kinds of things are not necessarily public artifacts. That is, they don't necessarily depend on public norms of creation, use, treatment, and so on, where they don't require, the attempt by the maker doesn't require social acceptance. Rather, I think what's going on is that, okay, you're going to make a salad fork. Well, Crusoe can make a salad fork. He just has to make something that's going to be used to eat salad with. And in the case that a lone maker makes, say, a salad fork, without any intention or the content of their intention referring to other people, then that just satisfies the first disjunct of the account, the disjunctive account I gave above. But if you're in a social context and you try to make a salad fork, then all of a sudden the thing you're making is going to be subject to public norms of how salad forks are made, what features they're supposed to have, how they're supposed to be used, how they're supposed to be treated, in what context, by who, and so on. So imagine, Robinson Crusoe makes a throne for himself to rule over his little island. Well, he can make a throne, and that satisfies the first disjunct. But if he then goes back to civilization and makes a throne, well, all of a sudden that second throne is subject to throne norms of creation, use, treatment, regard, and so on. And there's going to be a social group that will accept his attempt to make a throne in that second instance as successful or not. Okay, so I take this to show that the public-private distinction tracks individual artifacts, not artifact kinds. Now, you might say, oh, well, there's counterexamples to this. As I mentioned, I said, oh, offhandedly, like Crusoe can make a cathedral. You might say, well, no, he obviously can't. And similarly, like he can't make a skyscraper or a nuclear submarine or the Large Hadron Collider. And so these are counterexamples, and they show that at least some kinds are totally public artifacts, completely public artifacts, because they can't be produced or made without important reference to social groups. So this is right as far as it goes, but the difference here, I think, is physical and not rather than metaphysical. So what do I mean by that? Well, just the difference, why is it that Crusoe can't make a skyscraper? Well, it's not anything to do with skyscrapers, the kind of thing that a skyscraper is. Rather, it's because Crusoe's human with limited cognitive and physical abilities, and he's mortal. And it's in virtue of a skyscraper being really complicated that a single person on an island couldn't make one. So it just happens to be that some artifact kinds are so complicated that they need to be made with large groups of coordinating agents. But this doesn't show that they're necessarily, the kind is necessarily social in this important way that I'm trying to illuminate. Rather, it's just like, if you imagine, however far-fetched it might be, that Crusoe is immortal, that he has really advanced cognitive abilities, and he has all the materials, it might take him a really long time, but in which case he could produce a skyscraper, nuclear submarine, Large Hadron Collider, whatever. So these are not genuine counterexamples to my claim that the public-private distinction doesn't track artifact kinds. And so the difference here is that this is a physical limitation, not a metaphysical one. Okay, so 2 minutes left. So quickly, I've tried to develop in a sketchy form this account of the mind dependence of artifacts that is disjunctive. On the one hand, we have this disjunct that says, hey, they depend on, artifacts depend on the singular intentions of their makers. And then this other disjunct which says, oh, well, they might also depend on, the acceptance of a particular social group of the maker's intention as successful. So it's generally thought, and again, this goes back to Thomasson, that the kind of dependence involved in that first disjunct, that general condition on artifacts, is constitutive, rigid, historical dependence. So the maker's intention partly constitutes what it is to be that kind of thing. It's rigid insofar as that artifact had to have been made by that person with that intention. No one else could have made it. And it's historical in that it depends, at some point prior to or coincident with the existence of the artifact, that intention had to have happened. So does this hold for the second disjunct as well. I want to say no, just very quickly. I think it's generic rather than rigid dependent. So it doesn't have to be any particular group that came up and established that kind of norm. It just had to be that some group accepted and gave rise to or established that norm. But it doesn't matter which exact group it was. So this opens this question of, well, how do we individuate norms? I can't answer that here. But what I've tried to do is just show that artifacts have this important dimension of kind of social dependence to them. And in that way, they're maybe more similar to institutional kinds than is normally thought. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.